Hello, this is Stephanie Hughes of the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center. Today I'm going to be reviewing with you the new OMB data collection form for ACL dementia grantees. We'll start by reviewing the objectives of our training. First, we'll take a look at why the data collection form has changed and when you should begin using it. Next, we'll look closely at where the changes have been made and how to make the transition from the old form to the new form. We will include some reminders about the data collection process as we go. And finally, we'll talk about where you can get more information if you still have questions. So first, let's look at why have changes been made to the OMB data collection form. Periodically, ACL reviews the data being collected, and ultimately the data that we collect needs to connect to the purpose and goals of this program. The changes reflected in this new form are intended to better capture activities in several areas. First, people living alone. We know that there are many vulnerable people with dementia who do not technically live alone, but live with someone who is not willing or able to provide care. We wanted to be able to capture this underserved group in addition to people who are technically living alone. Second, professional training. Grantee work in providing dementia training to a whole range of service providers has continued to grow rapidly in recent years, and we want to better measure what types of providers are receiving training. Third, direct services. Changes to our measures of direct services will give us a better sense of how much work and time is spent on professional training activities versus direct services for people with dementia and their caregivers. And finally, there have been changes to expenditure reporting that are intended to make the reporting less confusing for grantees. As a reminder, all of the data that we collect ultimately supports many important aims. It helps you in assessing who your project is reaching, and it plays an important role in demonstrating your accomplishments to funders who can help support the sustainability of your work. The information collected on the OMB reporting form is also helpful and important in ACL being able to demonstrate the impact of these projects and sustain funding for the future of the program. These numbers are regularly reported to Congress and ACL leadership. So now let's look at how the new form is being rolled out and get into the specifics of what's changing. When do you make changes? Your grant must use the new OMB data collection form starting with this reporting period, which is the spring 2021 semi-annual report. If your grant has not yet incorporated the new data fields into your data collection process, that is okay. You can use the new data collection form to submit your spring data even if some or all of the new fields are left blank. So please work on updating your data collection process over the coming months so that by fall 2021, you will be able to report data on all of the new fields. The first tab in the OMB data collection form is the worksheet where you report persons living with dementia and their caregivers. Most of this form is exactly the same as it was before. There's only one change that's been made to this section of the data collection form, and that's in the last category, living arrangement. So here on the left, you see the 4 categories that were on the old form. Lives alone with an identified caregiver, lives alone with no identified caregiver, does not live alone, and living arrangement missing. On the new form, the category does not live alone has been divided into 2 categories: people who live with a caregiver and people who live with someone who's not a caregiver. These individuals who are not living alone but are living with someone who's not able to provide care may be just as vulnerable and in need of supportive services as those who are living alone. And so we want to appropriately track people who may fit that criteria. So what should you do with your old data and how should you enter this data going forward? Let's look at an example of how you submitted data for this category before and how you will transition it to the new form. In our first example here, you see the old data categories. In this case, the grantee has reported 5 people living alone with an identified caregiver, 15 living alone without a caregiver, 10 people who do not live alone, and 3 people who left the living arrangement category blank and therefore are recorded as having missing data. Now, let's see the categories on the new form, including the 2 new categories, lives with a caregiver and lives with someone who's not a caregiver. Many grant projects have probably not yet started collecting data for the 2 new categories, and therefore these lines may be blank this time around. That's fine. If you have started collecting data for these 2 new fields, you can go ahead and enter the numbers that you've collected there on the form. But what should you do with the old data from the does not live alone category? There's no place on the new form to record that data. And most projects will not have a way of dividing that category into the 2 new categories. What we're asking you to do is to add the number of people who do not live alone to your living arrangement missing number. So in this case, the 10 people at the top who do not live alone are added to the 3 with the living arrangement missing and reported as a total here of 13 people with living arrangement missing. However, and this is important, we don't want to lose the information that you collected in the past. And so the Resource Center is going to preserve the data from the does not live alone category in our aggregate data file. In order for us to be able to do this, what we're asking is that the first time you submit the new form, please make a note within the spreadsheet to indicate how many of the people in the missing category should be coded as do not live alone. And we will make a record of this in our aggregate data file. So you only have to provide this note once. You don't have to share it going forward. Starting with the fall reporting period, and after that, you can simply continue to include that number of people who do not live alone as part of your living arrangement missing category. But we will preserve that data from the does not live alone category going forward so that that information is not lost. Before we move on to the professional training worksheet, let's go over just a few reminders about the data that you submit on people living alone with dementia and caregivers. First, data should be cumulative. When reporting data, numbers on the OMB data collection form should reflect all activities from the start date of your grant to the last day of the reporting period. Data are also unduplicated. Each person you serve should be reported only once. So if someone receives more than one service, they still should be reported just once on the form. Only report data for those individuals who are actually receiving services. So for example, if you provide adult day to the person with dementia, you will report data for the person with dementia, but not for their caregiver. If a caregiver attends a training or education program, you will report the caregiver's demographics, but not the demographics of the person they care for. As a reminder, all categories are required. So it may be that some of your participants leave certain fields blank when they are filling out the form, and that can be counted as missing data. But grantees are asked, however, to include all fields on their data collection forms. Please be sure to check your numbers before you submit them. The totals for each category must match the totals row at the top of the spreadsheet. There's one exception to this, which is race data, because participants are allowed to select more than one category. So in some cases, that number may be greater than your total at the top. For every other category, the number within the category should match the number in your totals row. Also, a reminder that project staff must enter the minority status of each participant based on the race and ethnicity categories that the participant indicates. This is not a field that should be filled out by the participant. And I just want to point you to the new definitions and FAQs document for more details on any of these questions. There's actually a detailed table related to the minority status and how to code that. So that can be a really helpful reference for you if you have any confusion about that category. So let's move on to the next worksheet within the OMB data collection form, which is where you record the number of professionals that you have trained. This tab or worksheet is where you'll see the greatest number of changes to the OMB data collection form. So as you can see here, we've added several new categories, including allied health professionals, volunteers, financial professionals, students who are preparing for dementia-related work, and this may include people like nursing students, social work students, or medical students. We've also added a category for profession missing. So again, all training attendees should be asked to indicate their profession, but if they have left that field blank, you can count them under the professionals missing category. We also have renamed two categories. The category that used to be called health educators is now called other dementia-related program providers. This can include people like adult day staff, support group facilitators, or savvy caregiver facilitators. The category that used to be called healthcare providers is now called medical care providers. And both of these changes were really made only to help clarify who should be counted within these categories. I want to note as well that some categories are in a different order than before, and some of the examples listed after each category have changed. So please review the form carefully so that you're very familiar with what the changes are to the form. Just some general reminders about professional training data. Remember that the categories on the form are based on people's roles, not on their specific job titles. So someone like a nurse or a social worker could potentially fit into many of the categories on the form. And we just ask that people select the role that most closely fits with the role for which they're being trained. Professionals trained numbers, like the person served numbers, should be unduplicated. So if someone attends more than one training as part of your project, they are only counted one time. The trainees that we're counting on this tab are those who receive dementia training. This does not include people who attend general outreach and awareness events. So typically, a training program is going to involve learning objectives or an increase in knowledge or skills that is being measured as part of your evaluation plan. But if you're not clear on what counts as professional training, again, I suggest you refer to the definitions and FAQs document and talk to your TA staff if you continue to have questions. Finally, again, please have participants select these categories rather than have your project staff try to assign this category to your attendees. Now we'll move on to the final worksheet in the OMB data collection form, which includes direct units of service and expenditures data. So there are two changes to this worksheet. The first change is that grants are now asked to report direct service units separately for people served and for professionals trained. You'll still report the total direct service units as well. So if your grant isn't already doing so, please incorporate this change going forward so that you can track these two categories separately. When you're transitioning to the new data collection form, there are two options for how to move your data over. So first, for some projects, it will be possible, and if it's not too cumbersome, you may be able to go back and separate your previously reported direct service units into these two categories, one for people with dementia and caregivers and one for professionals trained. This is what we see in this first example here. So they've reported a total of 900 units of direct service, including 600 for people with dementia and caregivers and 300 to professionals. And you can see that these two categories add up to the total reported. Some grants, however, may not be able to go back retroactively to determine how many units of service fit into each of these categories, and that's okay. So if that's the case, please report your direct service units for the two categories going forward. So start collecting those two categories for future data. And then add the total units of service from your old form to the new total that you're tracking. So in this example, you can see the grant has begun tracking direct service units by category, and they're reporting 200 units for people with dementia and caregivers and 100 for professionals. But the total reported is 600. That's because they've added the 300 units of service that were carried over from the old form. So if your grant fits into this scenario where you are not able to separate out your old data into these two categories, then you're going to see that the total units you report are always going to be greater than the sum of the two lines above. So let's just briefly review some other information about direct service units. Again, typically 1 unit of direct service equals 1 hour of service. And these units are counted for each person who receives services. So if you have multiple people who attend a memory cafe, a dementia training, adult day programming, or some other group activity, each person who attends is counted for each hour of direct service they receive. In this example here, if there's a 2-hour training provided to 20 attendees, that would count as 40 direct service units. Okay, so we looked at the first part of the services and expenditures worksheet, which is the direct service units field and how that's being divided into two categories. Now we will look at the second change that's being made to this worksheet, and that relates to how you report your grant expenditures. So the fields shown in black here are those that were on the old data collection form. The line in blue is new. As hopefully all of you are aware, there are actually 3 categories of expenditures made by grants: direct service expenses, administrative expenses, and other programmatic expenses. The categories themselves are not new. The only thing that's new is that you are being asked to report all 3 categories. In the past, you were only asked to report on administrative and direct service expenditures. Now you are required to also report the percentage of funds spent on other programmatic expenses. These calculations are always based on the total grant funds that you have spent to date, including both federal and match funds. And this means that the percentages that you are reporting should always add up to 100% because these are the only possible 3 categories of expenditures. So in this example here, we see there 55% went to direct services, 5% to administrative expenses, 40% other programmatic expenses, which adds up to a total of 100%. Again, there is more detail within the definitions and FAQs document. So if you have questions about what counts for each of these categories or how to calculate the percentages of expenditures, please refer to that document. So we'll wrap up with a few general reminders about your OMB data. First, when submitting your data, please use the exact Excel spreadsheet that has been provided. Do not change it by adding or removing any rows, columns, or formulas, and please send it in an Excel format. Every time you submit the data, you should be reporting cumulative numbers, that is, numbers from the start date of your grant up through the end of the current reporting period. And finally, we do often encounter errors when checking the data that is submitted, so it's really helpful if you can double or even triple check your numbers before submitting your data to make sure that they all add up consistently and correctly. We do perform within the Resource Center an internal review of all the data before the final report is submitted to ACL, and we will come back to you and ask you to correct your report if the numbers do not add up correctly. So it saves all of us some time if that is checked before it's submitted the first time. So I thank you for your attention to this training. Again, the data that you submit is very important both to your team and to ACL. Following the appropriate steps helps all of us. If you have any questions after watching this training, there are several resources for you. As mentioned many times throughout, the definitions and FAQs document contains a great deal of information and detail. It's available through the NADRC website, as well as through your Resource Center staff person. You can also direct questions to me, Stephanie Hughes, at the email shown here, or you can contact your TA staff person who's always available to provide support.